Part 17, Chapter 9. Only the uppermost sliver of sun revealed itself the following day, signalling the beginning of the vernal equinox, and the beginning of 6 months of total darkness. The men had gathered in the recreation room. Clark sat in a chair surrounded by his now suspicious co-workers. The dog handler looked frazzled and sounded defensive. "I'm telling you," he said for at least the 10th time, "that I don't remember leaving the kennel unlatched." Childs stood nearby. He was holding the well-used torch, having shortened its range in the event it had to be employed inside. He waved it meaningfully under Clark's nose. "That's bullshit. You told us after those dogs split that you always check it." "I always do." Clark chewed his lower lip and tried to sound confident. He wasn't. The torch was too damn close. "They must have opened it after I closed up for the night." "You left it open," Childs said accusingly, "so they could get out." Clark kept his exasperation in check, along with the sarcastic reply that immediately came to mind. Sarcasm wasn't prudent just now, considering the expressions on the faces of the men encircling him. Childs' attitude was that he'd be glad to try out the industrial torch indoors, if Clark would just give him the slightest excuse. "Would I even have told the rest of you that they had gone if I had anything to hide?" he argued fervently. "Would I have told you that I regularly checked the latch after I deliberately left it open? Be reasonable." "That still doesn't explain why you didn't kennel the stray right away," Gary pointed out. "I told you that I couldn't find—" He paused, angrily shoving the nozzle of the torch aside. "Keep that thing out of my face, will you?" Childs reached out with one hand, grabbed the handler by the collar, and lifted him out of the chair. The mechanic was right on the edge, had been ever since they'd returned to camp. He was still thinking of Bennings and wondering if they'd managed to kill him while he was still Bennings. "Don't you be telling me—" Knowles stepped between them and spoke sharply to the mechanic. "Lighten your load, sucker! You ain't the judge and executioner around here." Childs reluctantly let go of the dog handler. Clark slumped back in his chair, keeping a wary eye on the mechanic as he spoke to Knowles. "Thanks," he said gratefully. Childs turned his frustration and anger on the peacemaker. "Who you trying to protect, motherfucker? I'm trying to tell you that this son of a bitch could be one of them. You want one of those things that could be anybody messing around in your kitchen, man?" Gary separated them. No one noticed McCready out in the hallway, watching the confrontation. He'd been outside, rummaging around in the trash dump. He had a bundle tucked under one arm. "Now hold on, damn it!" the station manager told the two combatants. He struggled to keep his voice level. "We're getting nowhere acting like this. Fighting and arguing isn't going to prove anything. If this bit of Blair's theory about this thing taking over cellular structures all the way up to the brain is correct, then that dog could have gotten to anybody. It had enough time. A whole night. And if it got to Clark or anyone else, put in Copper quietly from his seat near the big card table, then Clark or anyone else could have gotten to somebody else. That's about right, Macready decided. A few eyes turned to him as he stepped into the room, but the attention was still on the speculating doctor. Copper cleared his throat. Now, what I'm saying is that, theoretically, any of us could now be whatever the hell that thing was. It learns fast. Too damn fast. It can be subtle when it has to, can bide its time, like those two changed dogs did. Norris shook his head, rubbing his chest and grimacing at the slight but persistent pain there. It's too much to absorb all at once, Doc. I can buy the business about the dogs. I saw that. But taking over several of us and keeping it a secret from the rest? Hell, we all know each other. If some alien whatsis has gained control of Clark. The handler stiffened at the sound of his name. Or Childs, or me, or anyone else. Wouldn't it give itself away somehow? Wouldn't it make a mistake? Do something obviously wrong that the rest of us would pick up on? Copper smiled humorlessly. If it can become enough of a dog to fool another dog with its acute canine senses, then why not a man? This thing arrived here in an extraterrestrial vehicle. It's not an animal. It's highly intelligent as well as extremely adaptable. All it needs to survive is an organic host to take control of. Why not a man instead of a dog? It's just too damn wild, Norris argued weakly. I can't believe it. Not without stronger evidence than some overcome sled dogs. Macready pushed back the sombrero he was wearing. Well, you can believe it now. He dumped the dirty bundle he was carrying onto the card table. It was the shredded pair of long johns that Knowles had found in the kitchen waste bin. Knowles found this yesterday, remember? It's ripped just like the clothing on the Norwegian we brought back. The same thing was happening to Benning's clothes when Childs and I got to him. Seems that these things don't imitate clothes. Just flesh and blood. Anything organic. Copper was muttering. He pulled up one leg of his own pants and checked the long underwear beneath it. Damn art. Artificial, not wool. If it was wool, the thing might be able to imitate that too. The men looked from one to another, silent, thinking. Macready picked up the ruined clothing and checked the label on the waistband. It's damn art too, Doc, but there's more important information here than that. For instance, said Norris challengingly. For instance, the size. Large in this case. He grinned maliciously and studied the nervous cluster of men. His gaze settled on the one sitting in their midst. What size do you wear, Clark? The dog handler shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His lower lip showed blood. So what if I do? He snapped back. Yeah, Norris added. What if he does? I wear a large too. Extra large, said Childs smugly. Large, said Copper. And me too. Macready's gaze travelled around the room. Most of us do. The feeling of unease in the room intensified. Macready let them stew over this new thought a while before continuing. I doubt if it got to more than 1 or 2 of us. 2 at the most. It didn't have enough time for more than that. Besides, if it had, I don't think we'd be standing here debating it right now. We'd all be trying to blow each other's heads off, like those poor damn Norwegians. Or else we wouldn't be trying to, which would be worse. But it definitely got to someone. He let that sink in before adding, somebody in this room ain't who it claims on his driver's license. Sanders didn't even try to conceal his fright. Then what are we going to do? Norris turned to Copper. Fuchs was standing next to the doctor, looking thoughtful. Can there be some kind of test? The geophysicist asked. Surely, if this thing alters cell structure and other biological functions as radically as Blair seems to think it does, there ought to be some way of detecting the changes. Some way of finding out who's what. Possibly a serum test. Copper finally whispered. Yes, that should work. Right! Fuchs's enthusiasm was genuine. Why not? What's a serum test? The station manager wanted to know. And how much work's involved? It's a simple blood typing test, Copper explained. The men crowded around him to listen. As Blair explained, the thing engenders severe alterations in the cell structure of its hosts. I think that would show up in a check of any basic bodily fluid, such as lymph or blood, or urine for that matter. But a blood test would be easier and harder to fix. As to what's involved, he told Gary, we mix someone's blood with uncontaminated human blood, blood we know to be the real thing. If we don't get the proper serum reaction, it's at least a good indication that the person the blood was drawn from is something other than normal. But this thing's takeover is complete, down to mustache hairs, Macready argued. But not down to follicular cells. If we could analyze one of those hairs properly, I don't see how it could alter its new cell structure enough to fool so basic a test. It's worth a try anyway. It's simple and fast. If it doesn't work, we can always try something else. Sounds good to me, Doc. Except for one thing, said Childs. What's that? Childs looked at the assembled, anxious faces. Whose uncontaminated blood are we gonna use? Copper smiled. That's where we've got it. We've got whole blood in storage. He sought the station manager's approval. What about it, Gary? Shall I go ahead and set it up? Fuchs can assist me. Gary mulled the proposition over, then turned to the eager assistant biologist. "What's your opinion, Fuchs?" "I think it's a hell of a smart idea, Chief. Blair would be the first to approve." The station manager looked slightly uneasy. "Unfortunately, our senior biologist isn't in any position to be making rational evaluations of test procedures or anything else right now. But if you go along with the doc..." "I certainly do." Fuchs nodded vigorously. "Then we'll give it a shot. Like you say, Doc, we can always try something else next if this test turns out inconclusive. How long will it take you to get it ready?" Copper considered, then ventured a conservative estimate. A couple of hours should be enough, provided that I'm not interfered with." "There'll be somebody with the two of you at all times. Get going." He took a key off the ring hanging from his belt and handed it to the doctor. Copper and the young biologist headed for the infirmary. The rest of the men milled around, chatting amiably. Now that they were going to find out who was real and who was faking it, they relaxed visibly. "How'd that thing ever get to those 3 dogs?" Palmer asked MacCready. "I thought we stopped it in time." Copper isn't sure, but he thinks they may have swallowed functioning pieces of it during the fight in the kennel. "And that's enough?" "I don't see why not." The pilot was enjoying his assistant's queasiness. "No reason why it can't take you over from the inside out. I think it'd be a lot easier. The tendon-like organs wouldn't have to reach nearly as far if they began growing inside your stomach instead of..." Palmer turned away, adding weakly, "Never mind. Sorry I asked. I'll take Copper's word for it. At least now, maybe, we'll find out if those dogs were the last thing it got to." MacCready muttered darkly. "Maybe it didn't have time that night to get to anything else." "Gary!" The shout came from down the corridor, faint but imperative. "The rest of you too! Come here!" MacCready looked sharply at Palmer. The latter's bilious expression had vanished. "That's Copper." As one man, the crew rushed down the hallway and turned the bend into the infirmary. Fuchs and Copper were there, standing in front of the open storage refrigerator. The inside was a disaster area. Broken glass and dried blood caked the porcelain. Every bottle and container had been opened, dumped, and then shattered. Copper was gaping in disbelief at the destruction. His normal composure was gone. His face was pale. "Somebody got inside, got to the blood, sabotaged it. There isn't an ounce left that's usable. Oh my God." Knowles was muttering. He looked around at his companions. "No dog could do something like this. Opening a kennel latch, that was one thing, sure. But breaking into a locked refrigerator? And that means that..." MacCready pushed his way through the horrified silence and examined the open door. "How was it broken into?" "That's just it," Copper told him slowly. "It wasn't. Somebody opened it, closed it up after they finished their work so it wouldn't show, and then locked it again. If it had been broken into, I would have noticed it before now. Sanders had backed away from the refrigerator as though it were a live thing, until he'd come up against the far wall. He kept his back against it, whispering in Spanish, and trying to keep space between himself and his nearest neighbor.